So this week we're going to be talking about a very important topic, comprehension. What do we need to teach our students in order to help them better comprehend what they read? This is one of the most important topics for language arts methods. So I would like for you to read these words. My guess is that some of you could pronounce the words, perhaps not with proper pronunciation, but you could pronounce the words on the former slide. However, on this slide, most of you can read this and comprehend it extremely well. In fact, I would say all of us who are in this class can do that. So reading is not about calling words. Reading is about making meaning. I'm sure you've had students in the past who could call words. However, when they were done reading, they could not tell you what they had read. Their comprehension was flawed. Since reading is all about making meaning, that's a big problem. One of my favorite things to think about when I'm teaching students how to read is that I'm teaching them how to better understand God's Word, the written Word. And this is one of the verses that I most would like for them to be able to read. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. So there are many elements that affect comprehension. And if we look at it through the lens of the sociocultural, the things that we have to consider as we're teaching comprehension are the reader, the text, and the activity, or what is the purpose of the reading. So the reader is going to come to the text with certain amounts of background knowledge and various experiences and various skills. All of those will affect comprehension, as well as the text and the activity. So one of the most beautiful things about the way that God made us is that our brain is constantly growing and changing depending on what we put into it. The schema theory states that we all have schema in our brains. So basically, schema are like storage cabinets in our brains that have file folders that store information about concepts, events, emotions, and roles. And the better we help our students organize what they are learning, the more their knowledge will be easily accessed and kept by them. Our schema come from our life experiences, and we know that when new learning takes place, the brain adds neurons and connects new information into what is known using synapses. And we can use it or lose it. The brain takes away synapses and it adds them. So it's important to use it or lose it. Another theory that can help us better understand the processes that take place when we are comprehending text is the construction integration theory. This theory explains what goes on inside of the brain of a reader when they do successfully understand a text. So what begins as a decoding process, a breaking down of letter by letter, needs to become, for us to be fluent and readers who understand what we're reading well, needs to become a cycle. As we process text clause by clause, we have many things going on in our brains, multiple simultaneous thinking processes that create memories. And whenever a student is struggling to comprehend, something is interfering with their cycles. That if they're struggling to decode and they're using so much energy of their brain to just break down the text, they're going to have less energy to create the memories of what they're trying to form comprehension about. So it's a very complex process that occurs through many avenues all at once as a reader is looking at text. So every single time we read and we're breaking down the clauses of what we read, the sets of words that we can see at one time and process. We have two phases of mental processing that occurs, the construction phase and the integration phase. During the construction phase of our meaning making, we are taking everything we already know from our prior knowledge and experiences, and we're bringing that to bear on the text in front of us. We're retrieving word meanings, specific word meanings. We're looking at the surface structure of the printed text as well as the grammatical structure, where the capital letters are, the commas, all of that. And we're analyzing each clause into idea units called propositions. Now the integration phase is when new ideas from the text are connected to our prior knowledge, and the new concepts that don't fit with the text meaning are deleted. Maybe we had an idea of what we thought it meant, but then we, as we read further, we begin to better understand, and we delete the wrong things, and we store in our memory banks the new things and connect them to our prior knowledge. So this is a pretty complex process that we do every time we process a single clause of what we're reading. So good readers very typically are able to read and do many of these processes effortlessly almost. And it's when our students don't do it effortlessly that we have to be really intentional about how to help them best make meaning as they read. And one of the best things that research has found that we can do is teach our students what happens in the brain of good readers when they read. So this is what I would always tell my students. I would say, when a good reader reads, they're always doing things in their brain that help them read better. And as they are doing that, they think about what they already know, they ask questions as they are reading, they look at the text structure and they analyze it. They're always making movies in their mind of what the text is saying, and in their minds they're also summarizing what's been said so that they can store the information in chunks better. So when we teach them, teach our students what happens in the brain of good readers, we do this best if we are focusing on these 5 strategies. There are many other strategies, and those strategies do bear they can help our students read better, and we should teach some of those. But we also need to focus on our biggest strategies the most. So much research has been done on reading comprehension, and what I like to look at are studies that are meta-analysis, studies that take many other studies, and they pull in the ones that are based on a solid research foundation. They're done in a way that makes them be able to be considered valid. And what these studies have shown from looking at many studies put together is that comprehension instruction is most effective when you have a great deal of text-focused dialogue among your students. If you are not having your students talk about what they're reading with each other, then you're not being effective as a reading teacher, as a language arts teacher. We also have found from research that students who are taught multiple comprehension strategies are the most successful. And this makes sense. Instead of spending a 6-week unit just on visualizing, we know that in the brains of good readers much more is happening besides just visualizing. So we want to introduce through Think Alouds several strategies, those 5 big ones, and we can spend more time on one and focus on that one, but we need to teach all of them and model all of them for our students so that they can be using them in conjunction with one another. And we also have to help the students use the strategies in a variety of text types and genres. When we're having our students only use the strategies in narrative text, we're missing the boat, because expository text, such as their textbook reading, is the most difficult for them typically. And we need to practice and do our think-alouds and all our good teaching with expository text, just as we do with a narrative text. In fact, it's more critical because that text is more difficult to understand. So we have to teach the students the strategies so that they can use them without us, use them independently and in all sorts of text. So when we think about what we need to teach our students in comprehension, we can start thinking about it very early, and even in pre-K and kindergarten. We need to teach them to think metacognitively. If they read something and it doesn't make sense, we need them to be able to recognize that it did not make sense. We need to teach them to make text-to-self connections. This happens very naturally, and if we are doing the best practices of letting our students discuss, the students who are doing this naturally can model for those who are not. And sometimes we get annoyed when we're telling the students, when we're reading and the students want to raise their hands and tell us what it reminds them of, but we have to recognize this is something that good readers do. What I would do with my kindergartners, my young children who love to talk, is I would always read a book through the first time in its entirety without making without doing any modeling of think-alouds myself or allowing the students to talk. Students at this age typically enjoy hearing books over and over again. And what we can do is, on the second and subsequent readings, we can do our own think-alouds to model, and we can allow the students to tell us what their connections are. Now, very young children, you may be thinking, cannot use graphic organizers. That is not true. You, during your shared reading time, can use graphic organizers with the students. They can be doing Venn diagrams. You can be doing story grammars with your students. One of the best things that we can do is allow our students to retell stories, because they rely on many comprehension strategies to do this. And when we teach them the difference between fantasy and realistic text, that's another type of thinking that is very good for them to be doing and should be taught in kindergarten. In first grade, we continue to practice all of those things, but we are much more intentional about meta-comprehension. We want them to become much better about thinking about when they don't understand and applying fix-up strategies. We also add predictions. We want our students to begin thinking about what might happen next. And we also want them to become adept at summarizing the main points of the story. Now, if we've done a good job of teaching the other concepts we've just discussed in kindergarten and first grade, we will have second graders who are ready to learn so much. I love teaching this grade level. Students at this age should be able to reread a sentence when their meaning is not clear without prompting. They should be able to understand and apply their knowledge of diagrams and graphs and charts when they're reading. Look at those, see what it adds to the text. They should be able to recall facts and details of the text. Read nonfiction for answers. I love the books that are at a reading level that second graders can understand, that are nonfiction, that I can refer them to. They can read those texts to answer their own questions, and that authentic type of learning is the very best for students to be doing when they're reading, to find out the answers to their own questions. It's very motivational. We teach students at this age to think about character traits, point of view, setting, problems, solutions, and outcomes. Some of you may be thinking that this is too advanced for second graders, but it is not. These students are if you are doing shared reading and mini lessons on these aspects of reading, they will be very capable of doing them. and it adds to their understanding. Now, text-to-text connections, we're adding to text-to-self connections, and we're teaching them to think about, oh, I read another book that reminds me of what I'm reading in this book. Or perhaps in our science book we read this, but in this other nonfiction book from the classroom library, it says this. So we're teaching them to make connections between books, to assimilate their reading knowledge. We're also teaching them to think about parts of speech, concrete nouns, active verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and to summarize and include the main idea. Now, third graders, very typically, we used to say that third graders were done learning to read and they're reading to learn. Now we know that often that's expected to happen a little bit earlier in second grade. Students can definitely begin doing that in second grade. But now when we think about third graders, we need to think of them as becoming more advanced readers. They are reading chapter books. They are able to think of words as clunks, things that don't make sense to them. They can summarize the key points from fiction and nonfiction. They can make connections about characters and events from different texts. They're even advanced enough to identify themes. They can start thinking about nonfiction text structures such as cause and effect, fact and opinion, and main idea and details. They should be able to ask how and why and what if questions when they're reading nonfiction. They should be able to use information and reasoning to examine the basis of hypotheses and opinions and reject those that don't have a good base. We should teach them to infer meanings from roots and prefixes and suffixes, to use the dictionary, and to use multiple sources to locate information. Now, as students are in fourth grade and up, we need to apply our standards very carefully. The standards help us make sure that we are spreading out instruction in a way that helps the students have a basis to build on and make their advanced knowledge. However, we all know that our students come to us knowing certain things. Whether the standards say they should be learning them at that grade, we need to know that we have to first assess what they know and first assess their interest. What do they want to know? Interest will help improve their comprehension and their desire to apply the strategies if we're considering that. So one of the most important things that we help our students develop is metacognition. And most students love using that word. I teach them that it's thinking about their thinking. We have to give them explicit explanation of their thinking about their thinking. When we teach them to monitor their comprehension, we're teaching them to develop metacognition. Not only do we teach them the strategies, we have to teach them how, when, and why to use them. One of the most important things we do is to model the use of those strategies, the comprehension monitoring strategies. And they need practice, guided practice, applying strategies during their reading and discussion of text in the classroom. That's so important. So we need to be having discussions, we need to be having guided reading to have a setting that works best for developing metacognition. So we already mentioned that the narrative text structure is often much easier for students to comprehend, which is probably due to the fact that our lives are lived in stories, and students have been hearing stories and telling stories from the time that they were young. So story grammar is something that we can teach our students to use to best think about a story, to make sure they understand a narrative story. And it also helps when we're teaching them this because it helps them become better writers of stories. So story grammar is just a way to organize when we think about what stories include. They should have a setting. They should have an initiating event that signals a change. I would always tell my students, if you don't have something going on in the story, it's probably not very interesting for your reader. So that's why when we tell stories and write stories, there are things going on in the story. we need to help our students understand that characters have a response to that initiating event, and they have goal-directed behaviors and consequences of those behaviors that lead to a resolution. So studies have shown that knowledge of story structure aids comprehension, and we can begin to talk about this in simple terms with even very young students. So with our youngest students, we teach them to think about beginning, middle, and end. With our older students, we teach them to think about what was the setting, what was the problem, what was the goal of the main character or characters, what events happened, and how did the story end, what was the resolution or the resolve, how were the problems resolved. If you choose excellent examples and you teach your students to think about the story grammar with graphic organizers, they will learn this very quickly. So why is expository reading and writing difficult? Why is it a little bit harder than narrative? Well, very often it involves specialized vocabulary and concepts, and very typically it's a very dense concept load. Many concepts at once are expected to be learned. Students often need concrete learning experiences to begin to understand their expository reading. Sometimes we're tempted to not supplement what we're teaching them from their expository reading in a way that lets them have those concrete learning experiences, but they're crucial to comprehension. So research has shown that being able to identify and use expository text structure helps readers comprehend. If we're teaching them to know what a text structure includes, then they can walk into a text with an expectation and a plan of attack. And it helps them organize the text mentally as they read, which of course will help them remember and understand better. So the basic text structures in expository text are description, sequence, causation, problem solution, comparison, and persuasion. So the work of learning all of these text structures will take a long time, which is why we need to be very intentional about what we choose to teach them. Description is one of the easiest to teach them in expository text structure, as well as sequence. The others we usually add as they have already learned about description and sequence. And if a student understands these text structures, they will better be able to understand the text that they're reading as they apply what they know about the text structure to what they are reading. So every text that we pick up has some text structures. Some texts have very few. However, when we're talking about expository text, we can typically expect to see quite a number of text features, including, and we teach our students to look at these, title, table of contents, index, glossary, headings, subtitles, sidebars, pictures or captions, diagrams, charts and graphs, maps, cutaways, and inset photos. We can go on feature walks. I love to have my students do this as a scavenger hunt where I give them sticky notes and we label various text features, and maybe they take 2 or 3 texts and they try to find all of them and to label it in the expository text. You would be surprised how many teachers do not teach their students to attend to these text structures as a way to better comprehend, and how many students don't ever use them as tools. If we teach our students to scan a table of contents, to rely on a glossary, to scan headings and subtitles before they read, to look at pictures and diagrams and others of the text features that are often in expository text, their comprehension will improve. So one way to do a text structure walk with our student is to make sure we're beginning with texts that our students already have some background knowledge for. We walk them through small amounts, scaffold the pronunciation of new words before the student discussions begin, and we ask students to reflect on how the text feature walk improved their comprehension. A fun way to do a text feature walk is to have students work in groups, and the first student reads a text structure, names the text feature, and reads it to the group. All the group members discuss, make predictions, ask questions, and make connections based on the text feature and how it might relate to the main idea. And then you go on. The next student will be the one to read the text feature, and they go throughout the text repeating this process. So first you will teach your students to look at how the text is organized by looking at the physical features. It makes a lot of sense once you begin doing this process with your students that you would always want to approach expository text in this way. Sometimes an entire book is organized around a specific text structure. Something that I would do is try to locate these books and have my students label the books according to what text structure they think that book was organized about. So this is a fun way if you are able to locate books that have all of these text structures, or maybe even some of them, and have students label them. So we've been talking about how text structure can help our students better comprehend text. Activating background knowledge is one of the other big comprehension strategies that we should be teaching our students. Telling tales is a fun one. We're going to talk about several activating background knowledge structures that we can use. When we are participating in telling tales, we're focusing on stimulating dialogue before reading. It's a discussion activity that happens before we read, and you model it with a big book in a shared reading setting with your students. But basically what you do is you have them make predictions about what they think they're going to read just by looking at the images found in the text. This is easy to do in a shared reading setting with the whole class, or in a small group setting when you're doing guided reading with a smaller book. And you can have the students work in pairs to view images in the text and take turns making predictions about consecutive images. So another comprehension structure for activating background knowledge is the double entry journal. When you're doing this, it takes a little pre-work by the teacher, but you basically read the text, you identify some key topics or concepts that the readers might have encountered in the past, and you form questions that will activate information on those topics. And you also form some post-reading questions that will require readers to review the reading selection in order to reflect productively. And you ask them to write 100 to 50 to 250 word responses, and you let them share those responses with partners or groups. So this is something that students can do before they read, and while they read, and after they read, if you are structuring it in that way. So another activating background knowledge structure that we can use with our students is the anticipation guide. This is when you list it's just make a list of statements about a subject before you read, and you put the subjects, the list of statements, you can have them on a sheet of paper that you pass out to the students, or you could have them written on the board or displayed using a projector or whiteboard. And the students read the statements and react to them. You have a discussion about the statements, on what their preconceived ideas and attitudes might be about a topic. So an example of this might be, say you're going to read the Pathways book, Journey to Joburg. You, before you begin reading the book, could ask your students to react to statements such as, sometimes children and teens may have to not tell their parents something in order to do a good deed, because the good deed might require danger. Do you think that's okay? Or you might ask them, people in the U.S. should not be able to travel across state lines without getting a paper that says they can if they are someone who could be mistaken for an illegal immigrant. Do you agree or disagree? So those topics go along with the book Journey to Joburg. If you have statements that are boring and not at least slightly controversial, this structure does not work very well. So another activating background knowledge technique that we can use was developed in 1969. It's directed reading thinking activity, and some of you may know it better by DRTA. The steps in a directed reading thinking activity are for the teacher to choose a text in advance. You read the text and you mark good stopping points where you ask your students to make predictions about what will happen next or what will be examined next. And you say, look at the title, or what do you think about this chapter? What do you think is going to be about? Just by looking at the title. That would be your first thing you might get asked. And you may, at other various stopping points, say, if you consider what the author has already written, what we've already read, what do you think will happen next, and why? If you choose carefully where you're stopping, this can generate excellent discussions and do a good job of helping our students activate their background knowledge and understand what comes next, because they've already thought about what might come next. When you do this technique does work best with narrative text, and you have to be patient with your students as they may be resistant at first. They want you to just read. They don't want to stop and talk about what's coming next. This is a good technique. You don't want to use it too frequently, because if the students are struggling because they want you to continue to read, they may become frustrated. But it is an excellent technique to use. Now here's an activating background knowledge structure that I'm sure many of you have used before, KWLs. When we do a KWL chart, before we read, think about a topic and we list everything that we already know about that topic. And then we think about what we want to know, and then we think about what we learned. Now, when I first used KWLs, I thought of them only as an activating background knowledge structure, but actually if you're using them correctly in the way they were originally designed to be used, we are able to do both before, during, and after reading techniques with a single KWL. The knowledge is where we list beforehand everything we already know, and that activates our background knowledge and gets us ready to read. Now, the questions that we listed before we read about what we want to know can be used as a during reading technique. When we're finding the answers, we can stop and write the answers, or we can talk about the answers that we found. Now, after we read, when we talk about what we learned from the book, then, or from the text, then we're doing our after reading technique. So, and this is not simply an activating background knowledge technique if it's used correctly. It is something we use at the beginning to activate background knowledge, but we should continue our KWL. I know when I was a very young teacher, I would often do the K and the W, but during the entire reading of the text, we ignored our W, and then we went back and we would do the L, and I was missing out on an important thing. When we stop as we read and we come to an answer, then we are doing the KWL structure the way that it was intended to be used. So when we do a KWL, this is an excellent way to do a KWL with your students, especially those who are a little older. First, as you select the text material for them to read, and you list the topic and key vocabulary from the text on the board, and you give KWL charts to each student. You ask them, based on their experience or knowledge of the topic and the vocabulary that you've listed, to tell what they already know about the topic. Then you can write your responses on the board, chart paper, or overhead in your K column. Then you think about the students to organize their thoughts, their background knowledge around ideas that go together. You develop headings that describe those ideas and put them at the bottom of your KWL chart. For each of the headings then, or the categories, you can have the students think specifically about that category, questions they have specifically in that and what they would like to know, and you can list those in the second column of the chart. Then as the students are reading the text during and after, you're having them write down what they learned in the third column. And as a group, you can have the students discuss what they learned and record it in the third column, and to revise their charts, making changes in their pre-reading knowledge. Ask them if they need to change any information from the first list. Together indicate with plus and minus signs information that was verified by the text, or did they think they knew something that they didn't know? They can put a minus sign by those things. This is really teaching them to integrate and assimilate their knowledge and reject thinking that was flawed. An excellent process for us to all learn to do. So after you have them complete steps 1 through 7, you can extend the process by adding the plus. Ask them to develop a concept map or a graphic organizer that integrates the information from the text. This might be done best in groups. And you can have the students use their concept map or graphic organizer to write a summary of the text. Another structure that we can have our students use, this is one that was developed many years ago, SQ3R. This is excellent for expository text. Basically, you use it to have your students set their purpose for reading and to engage them as they're reading by looking for answers to significant questions. So first we have them survey the text, glance through what they're going to be reading. Maybe it's a section of their science chapter, their social studies chapter. They survey the headings and the bold words. They might also look at the various text structures, such as the maps and charts and that sort of thing. And then they ask questions. As they are reading, they also are going to recite and then review. Those are the 3 R's: read, recite, review. So we will have them look over the reading material, that's the survey. Then we have them question, use the headings in the text to pose questions to yourself is what we tell them. Then we have them read. As they are reading, they are watching out for information that will contribute to answering their questions. That's the reciting. They may stop and say out loud what they found, and then reviewing is going back over the material. Maybe they look for questions that they didn't find the answer to, and they think about what they did learn as they read. So this is one of my favorite things that I read based on research. A study was done with 2 groups, and the first group was told that they needed to learn the material, and they were going to be tested over the material. And the second group was simply told, when you're reading, try to make this material meaningful to yourselves. Then the 2 groups were given a test over their recall of information, and they also wrote essays. And the group that was told to make the material meaningful to themselves actually scored better, both on recall, and their essays were more insightful and creative. So try out this strategy by telling your students this may entail thinking about how certain parts of the information remind you of past, present, or future experiences, deciding how the information could be important to yourself or someone else, or simply finding some significance of the story in relation to anyone and/or anything. Remember, what is meaningful to one person is not necessarily meaningful to another. So this structure is for older students. However, I think one of the reasons it's effective is that we acknowledge that our student is a very important part of the process when we're reading, and what they think and what they feel is important. Visualizing is another one of the most important comprehension strategies for teaching our students to use. And a good way to help those readers who have not learned to visualize is to create 3-step frames. You can have them fold a paper in thirds, or you can give them a paper that has 3 boxes. And you have your students think about and imagine what they can see from a text. It's best to start with, even with older students, with very simple stories, and you have the students work in pairs or small groups to create a series of 3 pictures to retell the events in a text using the dramatic movement. Now, the pictures that you're having them create should be as detailed as possible to include as many events from the text as they can. And you can either just have them present their drawings to the class, their 3-step frames to the class, or you can have the class, after you've done this a few times, you can have students work on a secret book that the others may not have read before, and then you have this group create their 3-step frame, and then you have another group try to act out the story based on the 3-step frame. That can be done just for fun, probably not something you would do very often. One of the most common ways and effective to have your students who don't visualize understand what good readers do in their brains when they're visualizing is to have students simply describe in a discussion what they can see in their own minds. You can also model this with teacher think alouds as to what you can see. So one of the important things we can do in discussions with our students to develop their comprehension is questioning. And questioning far too often falls into a very lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy, which is not what we want to do. We want to focus on the higher order thinking questions, such as, how is blank an example of blank? That's a great question to use in narrative and expository text. Why is blank significant? For example, after you learn about photosynthesis, you could ask your students, why is photosynthesis significant? You can have your students answer the question, what solutions would you suggest? So perhaps the character in the story has a problem and you can have the students suggest solutions. Perhaps it's a problem that they're encountering in one of their content area textbooks. For example, if they're reading about U.S. history, you might could ask them what solutions they would suggest for the colonists who are trying to get the king to understand that they don't appreciate being taxed when they don't have any say-so about those taxes. So all of these questions can be very good. If we are doing them in a discussion type setting, that is excellent because students learn how to think this way and answer this sort of questions without the additional burden of trying to get their thoughts down on paper. You can save these sorts of questions as a 1 or 2 questionnaire at the end of a quiz or test where you ask them to write an essay or short essay on this sort of question. All of these are very valuable for helping our students know how to think in a way that increases their comprehension. So another questioning technique that we can use is questioning the author. In this technique, you teach students to try to engage in a conversation with the author in which they are thinking of the author as a real person, and that real person made choices about how they wrote. And the students are encouraged to pose questions as they would if the author were present. A really effective way to do this is to show them examples in their textbooks or information books where something isn't done well, and they can question the author about why they chose to present the ideas the way they did when it's not the best way. You could even have them rewrite and try to show how they think that would have been done in a more effective way. We can prompt our students to think, and this could be an anchor chart in your classroom. What is the author trying to tell you? Why is the author telling you that? And is it said so that you can understand it? We encourage our students to restate what the author said, but more clearly, and we can ask them simply, what would you have said instead? So we spoke a while ago about comprehension monitoring and fix-up strategies, and I want to return to that again because it's so important. We have to teach our students how to know if they don't know, and then how to fix it. So often poor readers are accustomed to seeing reading as getting to the end of a passage of text. They're surviving it, they're not really attending that much to the passage, and they just want to get done so they can say that they read it. However, they probably have some very poor comprehension when they're done. So we need to teach them that we should expect to understand. If we don't understand, we should apply various strategies to fix our comprehension. So we're going to talk about clink and clunk and fix-ups. So one of my favorite fix-up strategies is click or clunk. This is where we ask our students to reflect at the end of a paragraph or maybe a section of their reading and just stop. They ask themselves, did that make sense? Did it click with my brain? If it didn't, if it clunked, then you ask them what's wrong and to try to fix it. We have to help them understand that when they read, they should pay attention. And when they're paying attention, if they come to something that doesn't make sense, they should stop. Something I always told my students is, maybe you weren't paying attention and you just need to reread it. Maybe you are confused about something and you need to reread a few sentences, or possibly read ahead a sentence or two to see if this will clear up your comprehension. You need to model this. As you're reading aloud, you can say, wait, that didn't make sense to me. I think I'm going to back up and reread a few sentences. Or you could say, as you're reading a sentence, I'm not sure what this word means, or what the author meant by this. And you can ask them to, you can show them how you go ahead and you read another sentence. And very often, especially in books that are for children and for young people, the author, when they use a difficult word, will define it in the next sentence or in the next few sentences. So we show them to use that as a strategy. Very important to do this. Students enjoy having the strategy click or clunk, and some people say clink or clunk. Having the strategy be practiced with a partner. Basically, you can have the students sit together and they read, one reads, and then the other one will signal with a thumbs up or a thumbs down or some other sort of fun signal whether that passage made sense to them. Did they have a clink or a clunk? And if they had a clunk, they should work together to solve the clunk. They can go through a passage of their science textbook that way, or another textbook, or just with narrative text. This strategy is very versatile. So these are strategies that I teach my students about how to fix their understanding if they don't know a word. I tell them they can sound out the word by stretching it and saying a sound for every letter they see. I tell them they can chunk the word, look for parts of the word, smaller words within the word or parts of words within the word. You ask them to link to a word they didn't know, a word they know that is similar. You also can, this is repetitive, look for smaller words in the word. You can ask them to use context clues to think about what would make sense. Another strategy is to ask someone else, hey, what does this mean? Or to look it up. And by looking it up, I don't think that we need to limit our students to just looking things up in the dictionary. Rather, we can allow them to use online tools such as dictionary.com. This can make them much more willing to learn new words if they're able to use technology to find the meanings of unknown words. So this is actually a strategy, a set of methods that I had posted on my classroom wall when I was teaching, that these are good fix-up methods. Reread the passage. That's one of the best ways to help your comprehension whenever you don't understand. Another thing that we can always try is to go back to other parts of the text and quickly scan. And like we said, reading on for a few sentences. Then you tell them to seek help, because if their comprehension is breaking down, it doesn't make sense to continue calling words. It's better to go ahead and stop and seek to fix up your comprehension. Here's an example mini lesson that we could conduct with our students on monitoring for comprehension. Another important strategy that we teach our students to use is summarizing, because this helps them think about what the relevant main ideas and details are and store it in their memory. Strategies for this are to collapse list, use topic sentences, get rid of unnecessary detail, collapse paragraphs, and then polish what they've done in order to have a summary, a written summary. An excellent way to begin teaching our students to summarize is to begin with oral summaries of everyday events. Go outside and play basketball with your students. Ask them to tell you what happened. And when you come inside, write down everything they say. Then ask them to tell you everything that happened with so many words, maybe only 10. This can help them understand a story can be told with great detail or with a small amount of detail, as long as the big idea is contained. One of the favorite structures that I used to teach summarization was the one-sentence summary. After each chapter of a Pathways book, I would, at the beginning of the year, do this each and every time with the class, but eventually my students were able to do this alone. I would have my students do a one-sentence summary of the chapter. Basically, you teach them to use this frame to write who or what did what, where, when, and why. Then they are to write a summary that cannot be more than 30 words. Afterwards, I would have my students call out their sentences and we would write them down, and then we would decide on parts of various sentences that could all be combined into the very best summary sentence of all. This is a structure that the students enjoy using, especially if you make it fun and you introduce it and you do it as a class the first many times that you do it. Students often enjoy doing a very limited summary. You can tell them that every word costs $1 and to write the cheapest summary sentence possible. They may be able to select as few as 2 words to write their summary, but they have to be able to justify how those 2 words do summarize the passage. Now, research has shown that when we're teaching our students multiple strategies, it can take up to 3 years of practice for students to effectively use multiple strategies. But using multiple strategies is what good readers do to improve comprehension, and it's well worth our efforts to teach our students to do this well. A structure that I enjoyed using with my students to promote interactive comprehension discussions was the PARIS technique. PARIS is an acronym that stands for predict, ask questions, retell, infer, and summarize. This combines before, during, and after strategies and can guide a discussion. You can, even if you train your students to do this in the whole class setting, ask them to use this in small groups and they can use it very effectively. Having readers respond to what they read can take place in a discussion. It can take place in many other ways as well. Something that I would do after I read to my students from the Pathways core book, very often I needed to begin teaching math or something else because I was in a multi-grade setting. So what I would do after I had done the whole class lesson read aloud from the core book, I would have the students who were not meeting with me in a smaller group for math or whatever subject, I would have them doing a reader response. These are examples of reader responses that I have my students do. A reading response journal is much like what I have you do for each of your weeks of this class. You can have something much simpler for your students, but if you compile it ahead of time, it can be something that you don't have to think about on a daily basis in your classroom. You can have students make simple picture books, a wanted poster of a character. They can send a letter to someone telling them about the book and why they should read it. They could rewrite part of the book as a reader's theater, make PowerPoints about the book, study the author and write a biography. They could write to the author. They could compare and contrast characters or settings or anything such as that. They can interview characters, posing questions and then writing how they think the character would answer. They can even compose an imaginary diary of one of the characters. So another way that we can have our students practicing their comprehension strategies and doing so with lots of discussion, which we know is a highly effective method for improving comprehension and engagement, is to have literacy circles. You'll hear these called different things, but basically literacy circles are when we have 3 to 6 students who are reading the same text, one that they chose. Before reading, each day the students receive a roll sheet that describes the specific discussion strategy to be used for that session. I often use literacy circles in my classroom as an activity during literacy rotations. This is something the students learn to do very well and very effectively. So in a literacy circle, each student has a role and they're responsible for that role. By having a student in charge of a role, which are usually different types of strategies, you can have a group discussion that contains the structure that some students need to be able to have a discussion about the text that stays on focus and encourages comprehension strategy use. You provide more opportunities for students to talk, which creates independence when you use literacy circles. And I always used accountability contracts for literacy circles and assigned points for those contracts. I have an example of one that you can see on another slide. So students can fulfill a variety of roles. These are some roles that some like to have their students use, but each of these roles are described in subsequent slides. So keep in mind that the roles are rotated. We don't always have the same student doing the same role. You may want to have the students do the same role for a week or a few days at a time in order to give them practice doing that role and to build confidence and competence within the role. The first role is sort of like the group leader, but I like to call it the facilitator. The facilitator is in charge of, while reading, developing questions that will lead to group discussion. This allows for clarification and feelings to be expressed. They might have a question such as, what do you think is going to happen next? What have you learned about the characters? Now this role, like all of the roles, is going to need to be taught to the students explicitly and practiced. One way that I did this is I would teach all of the roles. The entire class would practice each role, and then we would have a group sit in the center of the classroom and interact using the roles while the rest of the class watched. We called this Fishbowl. And we could do this on subsequent days with various students to allow them to build the ability to do each role and to do it well. The bridge builder is basically in charge of finding connections with the reading, and it can be text-to-text connections, text-to-self connections, text-to-world connections. All of these are important for the entire group to make, but the bridge builder is in charge of bringing up the connections that he or she made during that reading selection. Now, the member who is in charge of quotable quotes is looking for quotes to read to the group out loud. Maybe it's a beautifully written piece of writing, or it could just be something significant to the text. They read the selection to the group and then explain why they selected that particular quote. So a seed maker basically takes comments and questions that come to mind as they read. They present one seed at a time, and all of the students comment before the seed maker comments. For example, after a certain paragraph, the seed maker may say, "Now I made a prediction here. What are your predictions that you made before you read this passage?" And then all the other students respond, and then the seed maker tells what he or she predicted. Many things can be done with this, with the seed maker, but predictions and clearing up confusing sections of text are good ones to begin with. So having a group self-assessment that is must be completed for them to receive points is something that can keep a group on track. After students participate in their literacy circle, they should fill out some sort of self-assessment, both personally and for the group. It can be a checklist, it could be a reflective journal entry, they could even record what they thought about their session. So the last few slides on this presentation are not ones that I'm going to go over. It's bonus material. You can look through these if you would like, and if something looks interesting to you, see what you can learn about it, and then let me know if you have any questions.